nice spot out
It's
of the wind.
a good
It's nice
spot.
and warm here.
Yeah.
It's been a bit of a cold start to the year, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been so cold. It's been such a cold spring, hasn't it?
It still is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we had a couple of warm days the other day, and it was like, oh,
This is lovely.
what it should be like, isn't it? I've almost forgotten.
What I thought might be a nice way to start is for us to go round table and introduce who we are. David, do you want to go first?
Yes, David Falk. I manage the Suffolk Walking Festival. I've been involved in it since it started in 2008. Seen it grow and grow and grow over the years. It's become incredibly successful and popular. And I also work at Suffolk County Council as the Green Access Manager. So working on projects to improve access to the countryside, but also understand how people access the countryside.
I'm Marie Lagerberg. I live in Hoxton, so long-term Suffolk resident. I'm an amateur botanist who has gradually been dragged into doing slightly more talking about wildflowers here, and particularly with Mellis, where I teach a Introduction to Wildflower Identification course. But I'm involved in managing meadows, wildflower meadows and so on. So that's my area of interest, and we come here quite often because it's floriferously wonderful and has some terrific plants.
And the cowslips are all looking so lovely at
I
this
know,
time of year,
it's
aren't
gorgeous,
they?
isn't it?
All
It's
over the
absolutely
common.
beautiful.
So special. I'm Patrick Barkham. I'm a Guardian journalist. I write about nature and the environment, and I'm an author, and I've written some books about nature and travelling around Britain, and I've just written a biography of Roger Deakin, of course, who is this great former resident of Mellis and a lover of the common and inhabitor of this space that we're in, this magical place in North Suffolk.
And just to finish off, I'm Ben Heather from the Green Access team at Suffolk County Council. To start things off, as we are joined by a nature writer from East Anglia, I wanted to ask what it is about this corner of the country that's attracted so many nature writers to base themselves here over the years.
Good question, and it's quite hard to know, and I think there's a bit of a coincidence going on, really, because I think all these individual writers are so individualistic and have all very different sort of motives and reasons for being here. And just to look at some of the people who are alive today and writing, Richard Maybe famously came to Norfolk and Suffolk borders. He lives in the Waveney Valley as part of his kind of nature cure after a life in the in lovely wildlife rich Chilterns, but actually he found, after he suffered a mental breakdown, that coming to East Anglia was kind of a great liberation for him and inspired him, and he's written about that in his book Nature Cure. And then Robert Macfarlane, he's probably the most famous international British nature writer, really, and a brilliant writer, is here because of Cambridge University and in East Anglia, and it was where he studied and where he's taught all his adult life. So that would be the prime reason he's here, I guess. I'm here because I was born here. So I was born in Norfolk, and like many people, I worked away for many years, and then when I had children I wanted to return to the motherland. And
I did the same.
Exactly.
So I grew up near Bury St Edmunds, and the number of people we meet, my husband would say, you don't meet somebody here without one of them having dragged the other back. Because there's something glorious about it, isn't there?
We've said the same, haven't we? Said, if you've lived in Suffolk at some point, you always come back.
Yeah.
And if you move to Suffolk, you don't go, you stay, and that happens as well. So we've been here 21, 22 years and love it and don't want to move away. But what you were saying about people moving in, I met Melissa Harrison not very long ago, and she's moved here from London. A lot of people have moved out of that urban environment. Roger Deakin was in London, wasn't he, as a child, and come here. And there is something, I think, a hook in Suffolk that draws you to it. And once you've experienced it and you find these little quiet pockets that exist everywhere, you don't want to move back to an urban environment. You want to stay
I think there's a long history of writers here, isn't there? So people like Adrian Bell, who are writing here about the rural environment going back, pre-war and so on. And I think that long history, Sebald with his Rings of Saturn and that sort of thing, I think people have it in their consciousness somehow. It is part of a body of work that is quite captivating, isn't it? So people come and they see, and then they're hooked.
Is it something about just creatives in general then? Because if you could, go down that route, you're talking about all the famous artists who resided in Suffolk and, in this area as well. You've got Constable down in Gainsborough, down the south, the County Munnings.
Munnings is, well, he was on the Waveney, wasn't he? Absolutely. And Maggie Hamling,
yes,
currently.
Yes.
Artists are often drawn to the light, aren't they? And there are things that specifically draw artists, like the light. And certainly you'd say with some of the nature writers, they're drawn here particularly for the wealth of birds and bird life on our coasts, and the famous Suffolk sands and the coast of Suffolk and so forth. And so that's definitely a factor too. But I think artists are more convivial somehow and are often drawn to communities of artists, whereas writers are often more solitary, and so maybe there's less of a community. But it's certainly remarkable that there are so many. And of course Ronnie Blythe, who was Suffolk born and bred, and again is a sort of inspiring person for many younger writers today. And I suppose there's a little bit of practicality in that one of the reasons Roger came here was that it was very affordable, and it's probably less affordable now, but for someone like Melissa Harrison coming up from London, it's probably a fairly affordable place. Most writers aren't rolling in money, and if you're wanting to commune with nature, but in a place where you can perhaps afford a little house and
possibly accessible.
Accessible, yes.
Accessible,
you can still get back
into
London.
London, that's where the publishers are, I guess. So if from that practical level you want affordability, but you still have to get into town to see the publishers. So you've got those good links. It's an hour, if that.
And that was something Roger Deakin always enjoyed, and I think he enjoyed hearing. We can hear the trains going past us now, can't we?
Yeah.
And that they're a nice audible symbol of your proximity to London, or your ability to get there quickly if you wish.
Yes, and get
without
away.
without it lurking over you. You can't feel the tendrils of suburbia here.
Yes.
But you can get there and get away from it quickly.
There's something else that it is. And it's really peaceful standing here. Now the train has gone and moved away. Is that helpful in writing? Because you want peace and quiet, perhaps, to think, for your mind to wander. Is that beneficial being here rather than in an urban environment where you've got lots of noise going on and people talking and music and sounds? Whereas here you could really think, I guess, and let your mind wander. Is that a benefit of being in a location like this?
Definitely. I certainly find this place and Mellis Common inspiring as a writer, and I've sat here with my notebooks and felt inspired and written down thoughts and so on. And I know Roger clearly bonded very deeply with this place after he moved here in 1970 and found it a source of inspiration for his writing, and wrote very beautifully about the wildlife all around us in his notebooks. He did also, towards the end of his days, struggle with some of the noises of just like farm machinery, and some neighbours in that time in the early 2000s had a dog that wouldn't stop barking, and so you see in all his notebooks him getting quite agitated by those noises. So it isn't all a rural idyll all of the time, and I think sometimes when you're in a place so beautiful and tranquil, any noise that does appear is then more intrusive.
Amplified, isn't it? It really is.
Yeah. There's a history, amazing history also, with not just the human history but the natural history of Suffolk. There are still pockets of ancient woodland as well. I wonder if that's also a factor, the fact that you can find some almost totally unspoilt bits of the landscape, whereas in other parts of the country perhaps it's more managed than it is in this part of East Anglia. Maybe that's a factor as well that draws writers, especially nature writers, to this area.
I think so, definitely. And you've got a lovely walk from here just up to Burgate Woods, and Burgate Woods is beautiful. What
really
gorgeous wood with its you can see some medieval banks and ditches around the edge, and you can walk around the edge, can't you, on a public footpath, and you get this lovely sort of wood edge experience. And florally I think it's quite nice, really, isn't it? It's an ancient woodland.
Rich, yes. We are really lucky with some of the the sad thing is they're fragments, but the fragments that exist are very, very rich in what they offer.
Yes, I'm thinking of in other parts of the county, Staverton Thicks, for example, extraordinary landscape.
Oh, those beautiful, beautiful oaks.
The oaks, and also the
I've
very
never
tall
been, and I
hollies.
really want to go,
You
because
should
the
go.
nightingales are singing at this
Yeah.
time of year, aren't they?
Yes, and that landscape, as you just say, it draws in the wildlife. You hear that. I've been elsewhere in the country where at RSPB reserves they're excited because they have a bittern. I say, well, in Minsmere we have about a dozen or so. Do you know? So there's a lot of rich wildlife associated, I suppose, with that rich landscape as well.
I think there's something quite interesting about that, though, because I think what Suffolk has, it people in Suffolk accept as normal. And there was the wonderful plant atlas that was just released, wasn't there? 2020 sort of state of the nation map of the country and all of its plant diversity. So when we go to the coast, we see sea peas everywhere, don't we? It's very, very standard on our shingle. And then you look at the map and there's this tiny little rim around Suffolk and it's just here and the occasional spot somewhere else. There is something to be said about walking festivals and so on that reacquaint people with what it is they have and perhaps shine a light on how special it is, because unless you step away from it and you see that that doesn't exist somewhere else, I think it's quite easy to sort of overlook it almost.
It's that sense of place, isn't it?
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
So we're talking a little bit about fragmentation and habitats. Obviously, we were talking on the way here about Mellis Common, the fact it's a common and it still exists in such a large state. You know that this is probably one of the largest commons in the country, probably.
Yeah, I think it is one of the
I think it
largest in the
is.
country and the largest in East Anglia. It's a really substantial place.
How did it survive?
Maybe it's the common rights. I think it was owned by the Thornham Estate, by the Henniker Majors, and they gifted it to the Wildlife Trust in the late 1980s. So it's been managed by the Wildlife Trust as the owner, but there are people who still hold their common rights. I think it's a right to grazing large beasts. So that's very specific. You can't put sheep on here, but you could put cattle on here. And that's maintained it. So it used to be the case that that would have been an open grazing system, and they had gate boys, apparently, at the ends of the common. And beasts would mingle, people's large grazing beasts, and they would then take them off. And there's a window for grazing, and then there was a window where it was shut up over the winter time. And it's a very heavy clay, as much of Suffolk is very heavy clay, wet meadow, so it wouldn't have been suitable for grazing in the winter. And then that got sectioned off, but there aren't, as you can see, there's no compartments, there are no enclosures for animals. So now when people are grazing, they would electric fence largely. But I think that history of grazing and taking your animals off, relatively low intervention in terms of enriching it for hay cutting, as a grass crop. I think that management over time has meant that a lot of that land has been preserved in quite a rich floral state as opposed to a rich agricultural state.
And that's really important to say, that style of management to keep the nitrogen levels low, isn't it? To prevent rank vegetation taking over.
Absolutely. I think it's that terminology, isn't it, where a farmer might look at this and think of it as unimproved grassland. From a botany point of view, we would think it's hugely rich grassland in terms of its plant diversity, and that's certainly one of the reasons that the Wildlife Trust bring people here. Courses are taught here about the flora, because it really is a wonderful tapestry of species that have largely dwindled. And there are lots of statistics, aren't there, that are terribly gloomy about 97% of our wildflower meadows being lost. So these places become even more important to us.
What is the best time of year to come and visit for the wildflowers?
I think it's so interesting. It's a changing and a dynamic place, and that's one of the things that's so glorious about it. It isn't a static thing like a lawn that's green December through to January. So at the moment we're standing here and we're seeing the buttercups coming through. There are cowslips further down the meadow. There's this lovely little thing called Good Friday grass that times its emergence with Easter, which is rather glorious, field woodrush. And cuckoo flowers starting to come out at the moment, and it will roll through a whole series of changes. So you can come weekly and see a different tapestry of flowers. And I think that's one of the things that is so beautiful about Meadowland, is it's a very, very dynamic, changing population of plants coming in succession one after the other. So when you say what's the best time to come, and sort of late May, early June is probably when it's at its floral peak, but there are things very definitely bookending that mean that period of interest in it is very much extended. And then you have the whole process of cutting that changes its appearance again. The fringes in Mellis are obviously left wilder and rougher so that there's harbour. So Patrick, with your butterfly book, we always think of butterflies on flowers, but actually they spend an awful lot of their time as things in eggs and little larvae and caterpillars, and they need somewhere to overwinter. So again, our perceptions of the landscape, there might be some who think the rather kind of brambly fringes of this aren't terribly tidy, but they're really, really essential in bringing, creating that habitat for things to fulfill their life cycles.
I think that word you just touched on there is tidy, is a big word really in terms of nature conservation. We're obsessed with being tidy, and actually what we need to be is a bit more scruffy.
Yes, absolutely. But understanding that as well, and why that's important, and why those sort of rougher bits are left, and what they're doing. And I think, there is a slight detachment now where people don't understand what that's for, and I think when it's explained, there's a real understanding. Most people would love to see a butterfly on a flower, don't they? There's something beautiful and ephemeral about it. But when you think about the whole life of that creature, suddenly the rougher, untidy bits become more acceptable, don't they? So again, things like these walks and the opportunity to sort of think about the landscape and what it's providing, not just for us, but for the sort of ecosystem that's living here, is really, really important.
And I've seen orange tips flying around today,
Yes,
which of course their offspring are feeding on the cuckoo flower.
Yep.
That is in flower at the moment here in May. And that's lovely to see. And yeah, you get the grass feeding butterflies later in summer, all the meadow browns and the hedge browns flying through here.
Yeah, and the day-flying moths, the lovely 6-spot burnets that have their yellow egg cases, often on grasses, but they then need the knapweed. So those associations are really, really rich.
Roger described it rippling like an inland sea in midsummer, when the grass is at its peak, and of course all the grasses are flowering in their own way, and it's very beautiful. But then I don't mind it after it's been cut too, and there is a pleasing neatness about it post cut, and as you mentioned, Ben, that's taking all the nutrients out that we need for the more fragile wildflowers to thrive and flourish as part of the traditional management of the place. And it changes the way it looks as a landscape. Mellis Common is a bit like the sea. It's always changing, as you say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that idea that it's a product of very light intervention, so it's an environment in which people are comfortable, because people are part of that story of that grazing their animals, taking the animals off, cutting the hay. It's a thing of utility as well as beauty, isn't it? And that William Morris thing, things being useful and beautiful, and to my mind at least, wildflower meadows are absolutely those two things together. And the idea now, obviously we have far more enriched soil, so that annual cut being really, really important in terms of maintaining the low fertility that wildflowers need, which to a lot of people who garden might seem contradictory, where they're used to putting on the compost and enriching their flower beds. Our wildflowers don't need that. They need a much lower fertile environment to thrive. Would you have a favourite part?
I think visitors should ideally come for enough time to walk the whole common and feel the scale of it. And this sort of southwestern end feels more desolate to me, and the orange tip just flying past now. And then up at the sort of north end is more villagey, I suppose, but you certainly get these interesting wet corners and this lovely overgrown patches everywhere. And the birdsong in spring, early summer is wonderful, and you can hear blackcaps and garden warblers as well as chiff-chaffs and blackbirds and robins and the sort of usual garden birds that are all here too. But there's some really nice warblers in these hedgerows, and I know people in Mellis have heard nightingales until relatively recently, and there may still be one or two around because there's all this lovely bushy, scrubby stuff at the edge of the common. Let's see
We
something.
should have a quick look up at the top, because
Yes.
now is the time of the green-winged orchid,
Oh,
which,
wow.
which is starting to emerge. So the first ones in our meadow at home have just come out, and that's one of the. There's something unspeakably kind of exotic about an orchid in Britain, I think,
Yeah.
and the green-winged orchids are one of the more exotic plants at Mellis. So early visitors, you may not see quite so many plants, but the green-winged orchids are one of the things that you would see at this sort of late April, early May time of year.
The village bit's quite fun, slight aside, but it's got the most wonderful phone box, hasn't it?
Yes.
With stained glass in it, and when the
It's
sun
so
shines,
it was such a wonderful community project, wasn't it?
it's
It was a
lovely.
lovely thing to do. The panels that make up that box were all made up by different villages.
Oh, were they?
So they worked together,
Oh,
and they
right.
created the panels. So they all tell a story, and
It's stunning.
all done by local people. It's
It
a
really
wonderful
is.
sort of public art project.
Which is conveniently next to the pub, which is also quite useful. It's
Every
not-
amenity.
Every
All good
amenity.
walks need a pub
Indeed.
at the end of them.
Perfect.
Going back into historic land use, I read also that parts of it were used for clay extraction as well. We talked about the heavy clays underneath here, but some of the features which are left, the remnant ponds today, are
Absolutely.
from previous land use as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the lovely things, is that such a sort of mix, you touched on it earlier, that slightly watery edges and little pools of water here and there at different heights that they might dry over. Some of them, the shallower ones, might dry over the summer but then come back in winter, and all of those are creating what in sort of conservation terms is described as a mosaic of habitats, but it's this idea of things coming and going and providing niches for life to, different forms of life to exist.
There's some fabulous little ponds, aren't there,
Beautiful.
on the common. And it would, as you say, it would very quickly become a kind of sallow scrubland and then woodland,
Yeah.
if it
If it
wasn't
were left
grazed
totally.
and cut for hay, and that's obviously what sustains the wonderful wildflowers.
Since the late 80s, the Suffolk Wildlife Trust has owned the common. That was gifted to them, and they manage it alongside the people who are exercising their commoners' rights
Right, yeah.
to graze. Large grazing beasts, I think, is the right held by commoners.
It's a great
I love
term.
those. I love those distinctions. So no geese and no sheep, and whereas other graziers would have the right to march their sheep through town, or here it is the right to graze your large beasts and not to take a hay cut, and not. So there are a whole load of
Quite
specified
specific.
obligations, but those commoners' rights take precedence
Right.
to this day. So it's a negotiated environment.
Yeah, I don't believe it's entirely free of conflict and tension either, and that whenever there are people involved in any kind of management, there's going to be disagreements and tussles. And certainly you see in the last 50 years just how agriculture's changed, and all the little farms that backed onto the common have almost all disappeared,
Yeah.
and we're standing by one of the few traditional farms that remains, where the large grazing beasts from this farm here will come out onto the common for certain periods of time, as in accordance with their rights, that are very closely guarded and defended and still exercised, which is great, because it makes for the management of this place and its special quality.
Wander then?
Yeah,
Should
take
you
a
bit
wander.
down here?
Definitely.
How would you define Roger Deakin's life? Because he came to writing he was published quite late in his life. So how would you summarise his whole life?
So Roger Deakin is best known today. He's almost like the patron saint of wild swimming or open water swimming, because he wrote this wonderful book called Waterlog, where he began by swimming in what he called his moat, which is a linear pond outside his farmhouse, just through the trees over by where we're standing. And then he sort of swam through the lakes and rivers and occasionally lidos of Britain, and sort of created this wonderful alternative portrait of the British landscape and almost reclaimed our rivers and ponds for swimming. And Waterlog was published in 1999, and it kind of became a classic of British nature writing, but also a kind of word of mouth bestseller, in that loads of people discovered it. I remember reading it as a young man in about 2000 and just loving it. It's a lovely romantic portrayal of a Britain you didn't really realise exists.
Yes, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's relatively modern as a piece of writing still, isn't it? It's only 25 years old, and yet it invokes a sense of nostalgia for something, doesn't it?
Definitely.
That is still here, but there's something very evocative about it, isn't there? That it's somehow out of time.
Exactly. And Roger wrote it. He was of, as you said, of late middle age. He was in his 50s when he wrote it, and he never published another book in his lifetime. And he died tragically early, age 63, of a brain tumour in 2006. But his reputation has kind of grown since then, and he's had 2 books published since his death, which are beautiful, beautiful works of closely observed nature writing, both international and very local in scope. And he's become known as this kind of almost like this green god, but he's a much more interesting character than that. And he was an ad man in swinging 60s London, and he dropped out to embrace self-sufficiency in rural life here, buying Walnut Tree Farm in Mellis for £2,000 in 1970, and embraced self-sufficiency for a bit, and then decided to teach. And in those days you could just walk into teaching if you had a Cambridge degree, and so he became a teacher at this grammar school, where his former pupils still speak in awe and reverence of the kind of inspiring work that he did there. And then he became a freelance environmentalist. He founded a charity called Common Ground that championed hedgerows and lanes like this. He became an impresario. He put on gigs. He got Carole King to play, international star, to play at the Drove Road Festival. He made films. He turned his hand to almost everything. And you might say that he was of a generation and he was a man, and he had a very good education, who could do anything. They had doors opening for them, and maybe that was the case, but he sort of made absolutely the most of his freedoms and opportunities, and so led this incredibly rich life.
Really jack of all trades then.
Yeah, but in a very sort of romantic jack of all trades. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think his writing is absolutely beautiful. It's really engaging. You know, it's not every writer is like that, I think. You know, he just flows. His story just flows. Waterlogged and Wildwood. I loved reading both books, and you just don't put them down. So it's a really engaging style of writing he had as well, which is interesting if he came to it quite late in life. He had that skill, that ability all those years.
It's fascinating because he wrote his whole life, and the wonderful thing for me as his biographer was finding diaries and notebooks that he wrote when he was 10, and he kept them all, and so he's got this tremendous archive of writing, and he wrote the most wonderful letters to his friends throughout his life to entertain them and amuse them and tell stories. And so published writing was just the logical end point of all of that. And as you say, he was a beautiful writer who had sort of matured like fine wine with his writing, and become this lovely observer, a close observer of things, and
his notes from Walnut Tree Farm that were published, and that's a really beautiful, I mean, bringing it back to where we are as well.
Yeah.
That perspective on here is really rich to have, isn't it? If you're thinking about roots and what you can take that accompanies that, it's a wonderful voice to kind of carry with you on these journeys. Going down the Waveney, and you hear that voice describing it how it used to be. It's really quite magical.
Absolutely, yeah. That when you hear some of his radio broadcasts, he only made 3 programs before he died of radio, but you can find one of them at least online, can't you?
Yeah.
Cigarette on the Waveney.
Yes,
he's a wonderful storyteller
gorgeous
on the radio as well. Like a beautiful voice, and just brings out the magic in the everyday.
He was very well travelled, wasn't he?
Yeah. I mean, he loved travelling, and he had this interesting mix. Clearly, he bonded very deeply with Mellis and Mellis Common and the countryside here, but he had a restlessness about him, and he was always zooming off to do interesting things around around the country and then around the world. So he travelled the world for Wildwood, his book about trees and our relationship with wood, and discovered the origins of the apple tree in Kyrgyzstan, for instance, and went to Australia and explored relationships with trees there. And so he did a lot of living in his 63 years.
I love that in Wildwood he talks about going to Kyrgyzstan and, as you say, looking for the original apple trees. And he describes sitting in a cafe under a big tree. And as I read that, I thought, I'll go on Google Street View and see if it's still there. And sure enough, you get to the Street View of this cafe in Kyrgyzstan. I think it's in the capital city of Kyrgyzstan. And there's the photo of the tree, and you can see it. The tree is there at this cafe that he sat in when he was writing.
Wow,
which is
good
really
research.
wonderful.
I didn't think of doing that.
I just get curious. I get curious if places have changed much, But no, it's lovely to see. But yes, there's that comparison of places around Britain and then abroad. He does that really well, doesn't he?
Yeah. And we're at the start of this section of Cowpasture Lane from Mellis Common to the railway line, and this wouldn't exist if it was not for Roger. So this is a really interesting, more recent history of the place. And
how did
Mellis.
that come about, Patrick? Do you know the story behind him getting this put on the map, literally?
Yeah, I mean it's a good story too, in that it was a public right of way, and Roger heard locally that a farmer nearby was planning to plough it up, as he had done with the section beyond the railway line. And this was an era where we shouldn't judge the farmers too much for this, because this was an era where they were paid by the government to rip out hedgerows, improve the land. And here was about 1.5 acres of land that was owned by the farmer, had a public right of way across, but that he could potentially make use of. And so the farmer planned this, and he was going to chop down all the trees. This is a lovely green section of the lane with big trees on either side, and Roger heard about this, and so started trying to get a TPO, a tree protection order, put on all the trees along this section of the lane. And he lobbied the local council, the district council here, very fiercely to get this done and persuade them about why it was important. And for that he researched the history and told this lovely story of this medieval green lane and its importance, and florally what was here and under the trees, and it's effectively linear ancient woodland. And he persuaded the council, and they issued a TPO, and it was reported in the Eastern Daily Press. And the farmer saw it reported that Saturday morning and came out with chainsaws and started cutting down before the actual TPO could be served on him on the Monday. And they got some way with the butchery, and Roger was meanwhile phoning TV crews. So Roger then mobilised the media. This was Roger, the environmental activist, and got all the media down, and it kind of basically poured sort of embarrassment on this local farmer, like, what are you doing destroying this lane, and got a load of publicity and sort of stopped the work, and then the TPOs were served. But then there was this long legal battle about whether the farmer could remove the stumps of the trees. And Roger, in the press coverage of the time, there's this lovely quote from Roger, this lovely upbeat quote about this is a mere setback in the long history of Cowpasture Lane, and these trees have simply been coppiced, and they will regrow and regenerate much as before, and that historically they would have been coppiced by the local people and taken for firewood and so on. And positive as well, and saying this is okay, but we need to keep the stumps here. And so there was this long legal battle about whether tree stumps in the ground can have a TPO on them, whether they're still the tree.
And yet, talking to foresters, they would say that is the life of the tree, isn't it?
Yeah.
And actually our ancient trees are all the product of coppicing over time.
Yeah.
They are the thing that carries their life forward, aren't they?
And nowadays, with our recent scientific knowledge of the mycelium, the networks of fungi that link tree roots and so on, we would know more about how much life is in the ground. And Roger, eventually this went to the High Court, because the farmer did want to assert his right to the land. It was his land. He felt he had a right to do what he wanted on it, despite this right of way. And the trees were protected. and the tree stumps rather were protected, and the remaining trees were protected because the farmer had got about halfway with his destruction. And we walk along there today and you wouldn't know that the trees had been coppiced 40 years ago. This was 1981, so 42 years ago. And
they came back, did they? The trees.
And they've come back.
Yes,
They've
absolutely.
grown back, and it's a tunnel again. This section, and honestly, I didn't realise till I read that history that it was only 42 years of growth.
And
on
in
that lane.
time, we might come to celebrate the farmer who ensured the longevity of the trees,
Exactly.
as they'll outlive their compatriots
Exactly.
who weren't coppiced.
And there's a lovely postscript to this story, because on the other side of the railway, Cowpasture Lane continues, and this section was ploughed up, again with the support of the government, so no disgrace on the farmer. But the farmer's son, who inherited the farm, has put back the trees with the support of the local community here in Mellis and local charities, and 100 or more people came out as volunteers. I joined them actually one weekend a couple of winters ago, and they've replanted the trees that were grubbed up in the late 60s. So the farmer has restored, the next generation who are farming in a slightly different way have helped restore a section of the lane that was removed. And so there's this lovely cycle. And again, it just illustrates, I guess, Roger's point about the permanence of this green lane and how it continues to walk through our history.
It's an amazing story. Fantastic.
A botanist friend of mine was saying that he thought this spring, I don't know if you've noticed, that there's a huge amount of the red dead nettle everywhere in the verges.
Yes.
And he thinks that was last summer's drought repressing the more vigorous grass growth that actually helped that thrive this spring. What do you think?
I think it's possibly the suppression of the grasses around it. I also wonder if it was just that stress that caused whatever it was last year, caused them to set seed as quickly as possible, and because this competing growth was lower, that seed could set better.
Being successful.
Yeah.
So you can see the trees on our right were butchered or chopped right down 42 years ago, and the hedge line on our left, which borders Roger's farm, was not cut. But the two are almost the same now, and you wouldn't know, would you? And
no.
This becomes a wonderful, cool green tunnel in high summer. But at the moment, at this time of year, with the leaves just starting to come out, it's flooded with sunlight
and all this beautiful stitchwork, which is
my favourite flower. That is
absolutely beautiful. And the garlic mustard, which, talking about our orange tips, they would have been on that as well, wouldn't they? I think that's
Jack by the hedge.
Yeah,
that's what
one of their feed
springs
plants.
up so quickly.
Yeah.
No, it's lovely, and you've got that light for that lovely stitchwork.
It is lovely, isn't it? And I like the way their flowers, when they set seed, they bow down to the ground to drop their seed facing down.
Oh, I didn't know that.
You'll notice that now when you walk next.
Yeah. And there's an old apple tree in the lane here that's probably someone wandering along the lane 60 years ago, throwing an apple core to the side, and it growing up. Yeah, Maria, you're one of these botanists who sort of counts, I know, keen tree people who sort of count the roadside apple trees on a motorway journey, even on fairly gruesome roads like the North Circular in London, you can spot the self-sown or human-sown apple trees on the verges.
It has been suggested to me by my children that I might do that.
To keep you amused on long journeys.
Absolutely.
But
it's interesting, isn't it? You do see that, and last year was one of the we talked about seasonal changes. Last year seemed to have really favoured pyramidal orchids, and you'd go along roads where you'd normally see the odd one or two, and there were far more, and that's quite a nice way of keeping track of what's going on. So
we're talking about road verges here, really, and I do think this is a thing that Roger championed, and he spent his early years as an environmentalist saving the whale, which was this big international campaign to stop whaling in the late 70s. And then him and his friends realised that there was all this focus on the distant exotic nature, and we needed to we needed to protect the ordinary, everyday stuff, the things that isn't given grand scientific protection. It isn't a site of special scientific interest, just the verges and the churchyards and the hedgerows that were, of course, all been ripped up in the 70s and 80s with farm subsidies. And so he formed this charity called Common Ground. He wanted to call it the Hedgerow Society, but his friends wisely thought Common Ground was a bit better. So Roger founded this charity, and I think it was very prescient, because I think that's something that's really only being rediscovered now and in recent years, and particularly post-pandemic, the importance of having nature on our doorsteps, of having green space and accessible green space on our doorsteps. And I know this is a big thing for you, David.
Yeah.
And you know, everyone, it should be a modern day human right that everyone can access green space within a kilometre of their home. You know, this is so important for our mental and physical well-being, and I'm really pleased that so many organisations are starting to look more closely at this, including the NHS with green prescribing for people with health issues. And just, you know, the benefits of a short walk down a green lane like this. I mean, we've only strolled on a, you know,
Short section.
yeah, short section for 5 minutes, and it's just wonderful, isn't it?
A lot of research into the benefits, obviously, of walking, but the difference between walking in a built-up environment and a rural environment. And there's a phrase that economists talk about when doing behaviour research, which they refer to as hard fascination and soft fascination. If you walk in an urban environment, it's referred to as hard fascination. In fact, there's a lot of hard things happening, a lot of noise, a lot of disturbances, a lot of things to sort of occupy your mind. But if you come into the countryside, it's soft. And they say that makes a huge difference. If you go for a 3-mile walk in London, it's very, very, very different to going for a 3-mile walk here in the countryside. And that bit about making you feel more relaxed and clear in your mind works here. Whereas in London, you might do a 3-mile walk and actually feel more angst at the end of it than less, actually. But yeah, and the last few years have been fascinating. COVID and lockdown has really changed behaviours in a sort of almost surprising way, perhaps. But we know from research we've done that people are walking further on average. They're walking for longer on average. They're getting out more and about. I think that's partly why this year's festival has sold tickets so quickly. People want to go walking. They want to go walking in groups. They want to socialise. It's really changed behaviours a lot from pre-2020. We found that people are walking on average a quarter more, 25% more.
It's a big
25%
figure,
longer.
isn't it? That's a big rise.
That's not a marginal increase,
No.
at all?
And that was immediate research in 2022. We did that. The research, we'll do more research this year and see if the figure carries on, if that's sustained over time. But initially, yes, it went up dramatically. And we see that in our Right to Way team, because the public are very good at telling us if things aren't 100% on the Right to Way network, which is useful because we get reports in from the public telling us if a tree's fallen down or if a path's got overgrown or it's boggy or whatever. And those reports have doubled in volume since pre-COVID days. So we would, in 2019, get about 2,000 reports in a year. We now get 4,500 reports in a year.
What would be wonderful is to think that people are noticing then more, not just the fallen trees, but the other things that are around them, and sort of starting to build that familiarity that I think a lot of people lost with what are the flowers that grow near us, what are the trees that we have around us. It used to be very common knowledge, didn't it, that local flora and fauna, and perhaps that connectedness might sort of resurrect a little bit more.
It'd be lovely if it did. I know with things like foraging, we do foraging walks during the festival, and that knowledge is not as great obviously as it once was years ago. You have to find specialists now who know how to forage, and just knowing what's around enriches your day out. It makes it so much more exciting and interesting if you know the sound of a buzzard above you, or you recognise the flight of a sparrowhawk or something.
And also, Ben, your old job, sort of working in the Biodiversity Information Service, recording what it is, because conservation can only work if we understand what we have and whether it's increasing or decreasing, and that ability that as people build that familiarity with what's around them and are feeding that back, that's a huge resource as well.
And it's that sense of recording everything, because we don't know what tomorrow's rarity is going to be. So yeah, everything you see is worth reporting down and getting in contact with your local county recorder.
Yeah.
The act of recording and recording plants or flowers, or even reporting issues with rights of way, to me illustrates that people feel a stake in where they're walking and the place, and that's so important. And that, you know, there is that cliche, use it or lose it. You know, exactly. Public footpaths have disappeared because they haven't been used, and now they are being used more. They're being protected. And I was interviewing an environmental activist who wanted to encourage everyone to become, I thought it was just a nice phrase, nature guardians. And this idea that we could all be nature guardians, and we can all be rights of way guardians as well. And it's public ownership, isn't it? It's shared ownership, and it enriches us all, and it's such a good virtuous circle, and it feels like we are starting to re-establish that in a really beneficial way.
And it's all free to use.
Exactly, and income is no barrier, is it? And
ownership isn't a barrier either. It's someone may own it, but we all have the ability to use it and value it.
Past here on the train and always try and remember to look out, and I've often been busy writing my Roger biography on the train as we whiz past his pastures, and that's been a nice feeling.
I suppose we've touched on it briefly, but Roger and his affinity for wild swimming, he's pretty much swam everywhere, hasn't he?
I think he would see a bit of water and think, I'd fancy a dip in that. Let's do it. It was for him. It was partaking in the existence of things. It was immersing yourself more fully in the world, and he wasn't a sort of competitive swimmer or particularly strong swimmer even, but he always swam breaststroke, which he called the naturalist stroke, because of course you can admire all the lovely wildlife as you go, and certainly, you know, he had the perfect little pond in his garden to practice in, one of those natural, probably dug for clay to make the foundations of his house in the 16th century, and he would have a bracing dip there, and that was sort of acclimatised him to swimming his way around the rivers and lakes of Britain. But it was also very much, he was asserting the right to swim in these rivers, because of course we have this amazing network of public rights of way in Britain, which is unique and special, but our rights along rivers are often less public, and many stretches of river are privately owned and controlled, and so quite a lot of Roger's swimming in Waterlog, we see it, was defying the sort of privatisation of these rivers, and an assertion of our right to swim in the rivers of Britain.
And it's quite interesting now that wild swimming has really started to take off, hasn't it, in popularity? So it's quite ahead of his time, really.
Yeah, I mean, in many respects, it feels like he was quite pioneering and ahead of his time, and certainly he anticipated or helped push on this amazing growth in wild swimming, or outdoor swimming, or just swimming, as some people call it. But you know, it's a big thing, and particularly for people leading busy urban lives. I think for a lot of people, they've found it a tremendous boon for their overall health and well-being, and the buzz and the feeling of greatness that you get from immersing yourself in cold water is, well, the Romans knew all about it. I mean, everyone in human history has done it and discovered it or rediscovered it, and it feels like we're rediscovering it, the benefits of cold water.
It's meant to be very good for your circulation, isn't it?
Yeah, and heart and mental acuity, clarity, sort of casting off your worries. And Roger writes about the pleasures of swimming very beautifully.
And is it something that's just rubbed off on you now, or is it something you did previously?
Yeah, I grew up in rural Norfolk, and I was lucky enough to be a sort of 25-minute car journey from the beach. So I always swam quite a bit as a kid, but yeah, certainly researching Roger's life, I've done a few swims in some of the places where he swam, and it does encourage me to be more adventurous in my choice of swimming location. and it's still quite a hard thing to do, to go into a field and swim in a river where no one else is swimming. You know, it's quite a challenge sometimes, where you're perhaps unsure if you're allowed to be there or not. And Roger was a very brave person, and he did things despite landowners or just passers-by thinking he was a nut. And now it's a bit like it was once this way with jogging. I mean, my dad remembers jogging in Norfolk 40 years ago and getting sort of catcalls and people just thinking he was an idiot. And, you know, for Roger, swimming, it was a similarly lonely thing. And now you see so many people, oh yeah, they're wild swimming, aren't they? You know, it becomes an easier thing to do once more of us are doing it, and donning the old wetsuits and dry robes and all the fancy paraphernalia that you can choose to use or choose not to use. Roger always swore by black Speedos and a hand towel. He didn't like a too big a towel. Personally, I'd go for a slightly larger towel. Wren, very strident.
We were talking earlier about fragmentation, but really Cowpasture Lane, where we're walking now, is a great example of wildlife corridor, really, isn't it?
I mean, Ben, that's a really good point, because I guess we've been talking about Cowpasture Lane as this lovely historic thing, but this kind of green lane is the pathway for the future.
Absolutely.
In that if we could have this as the connectivity between our pockets of wildlife-rich space, whether it be woodland or common land, this would solve all our biodiversity problems, all the loss of wildlife that this country's experienced, you know, disastrously so in the last half century. And if we had cowpasture lanes running everywhere, reconnecting habitat, and this is most conservationists' aspiration now, isn't it? Landscape scale conservation, but green corridors, it's become a bit of a cliche. Well, here's a green corridor, here's how it could look. It could be a wonderful resource for the public as well as
and it's the coexistence, isn't it? We can walk here, but other things can too.
I suppose, the last question really is, you know, what is Roger's lasting legacy?
His legacy is 3 of the most interesting and best written books about British nature and landscape that you'll ever read, but it's also this place here where we're standing. It's Mellis Common and a walnut tree farm, the place he inhabited so deeply, and Cowpasture Lane, which he saved from destruction. So there's a real physical legacy as well as a written legacy. And I think there's a legacy, a friend of his speaks of the Roger ripples, the sort of ripple effect that Roger created through his persuasive writing and through his life, and the fact that so many people are swimming in the outdoors, in rivers again, and rediscovering the joys of the British countryside is to do with Roger and being inspired by him, and that's a sort of more intangible legacy that will ripple on for a long time to come.